I don't think so, no.
Oh. Okay.
All right, sit in the chair.
Oh, God. I don't like seeing myself.
All right, well, you're going to, like, clap your hands. Okay, like, okay. This is all going on the internet. This is going on.
He didn't say how many times, did he?
He did
So,
not. He did
now-
not give good directions.
Clap once. Not yet.
Oh, okay.
Like, so, clap once, and then you're going to say, welcome back, AP.
Okay.
You got to be excited about it. Don't cuss.
Did I say,
Like,
I'm so excited. Welcome back.
No, okay, all this is going on. I'm bleeping out the
No,
cuss
you're
word,
not.
but every bit of this is going on the internet. All right, so anyway, now clap once
Okay.
and say, welcome back, AP.
Okay. Now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Now. Welcome back, AP, from North Carolina.
Yeah, thank you, Mama. That only took like 10 minutes. All right, so all right, so there you go. I thought y'all would enjoy that. You want to say "ol"?
Yes.
Or...
Welcome to Saturday Night Live. Oh, Maria, you want to go to work?
All right. Anyway, all right. So let's get into it. Just to give you a heads up, I'm sending an email out that you're ridiculous. I'm sending you an email out that concerns everything again that needs to be done. Right. So this is going to be a series of 2 flips talking about Europe's economic dominance over the rest of the world. Right. So you can literally write Europe's economic dominance over the rest of the world. And we're going to talk about how that major shift is going to happen, right? Then coming back from break, we're going to talk about how the lives of Europeans drastically changed after this time period, right? How basically your walking around European was not focused on like middle-age, what's up in my hair? Middle-age commerce and agriculture anymore. They were much more concerned with the new world and new world view that the world had entered into, right? Leisure changed, fashion changed, how they spent their money or having money at all changed, right? But a lot of that starts here, okay? Now, you're also going to get sent links to the 2 quizzes that you got to get done before break's over. All right, so the Scientific Revolution Enlightenment Review one is about 30 questions long, and it's all on your phone, and it's multiple choice. It's cake, okay? You can take it as many times as you want, okay? But here's the only request, okay? I'm getting some different little things figured out about it, but I'm pretty confident that every time you try to play it, you need to enter in your name a little bit differently. So if it goes like Anthony O'Toole, and then you want to do it again, you go Anthony O'Toole, take 2, or Anthony O'Toole, secretary. I will keep your best score, all right? So, but it will be graded on a normal scale. And it's not hard, I promise. It's meant to be done quickly, though. Each question will only be up for a minute, and the quizzes themselves will be live until January 3rd, because I know that the day back from break is the day that a lot of you won't be at school. Senior skip days. All right. What? Did you call me a narc? My wife just called me a narc. All right, anyway, now, so let's get into it, shall we? So we got to talk really quickly about how agriculture and the production of foodstuffs is going to change drastically in Europe, right? Well, first and foremost, the old way. Before you talk about the agricultural revolution, when you talk about a revolution, you got to talk about where things came from, right? And this stuff, Mom's walking around with toilet paper rolls and making explosion sounds. You see where I get it from. So the old way, okay, because a revolution has to mean that, like, something has changed, right? So the old way of doing things was actually in the Middle Ages. It's called the open field system, right? So the open field system is when the land was divided into long, skinny fields that were constantly, planted, destroying the soil, right? Now, so as you can see right here, in this little document right here, you see like the little strips of land right there? Well, eventually, when they realized that the dirt was being absolutely wrecked, they started acquiring a system of allowing the land to rest, all right? What they would do when they allowed it to rest, it also meant fallow, all right? So that meant it allowed it to rejuvenate, but the problem is this limited your crop surpluses by 30%, right? What they would usually do is they would allow, like, whatever. Like, they would allow, like, small livestock to move around on it. Some people thought, like, fertilizing the soil and things like that, but it's also destroying it, putting too much nitrogen sometimes back into it, right? So this is a very old way of doing things. The entire village also shared the land, and each villager owned certain strips, and they really didn't produce. They barely produced enough to survive, right? This is the Middle Age way, okay? Each family owned a set number of strips. This is the old field, the open field system, the fallow rotations. You've got one thing of fields just sitting there doing nothing while you're growing like wheat and barley in the other two, right? So, like I said, animal diseases would spread easily during this. Drainage was also almost impossible. Individuals could not experiment with anything. One field's left fallow, land's wasted, where oxen turned, but it's big disadvantages, right? So, what's going to end up happening is your big major crops at the time, of course, are wheat, oats, rye, and beans, all right? So, population, though, it's also on the rise, right? So, revolutions are usually incurred by a need, right? You need something. A political revolution is you need more rights, okay? So, the agricultural revolution is stirred forward by need because as population began to rise, the prices of bread begin to rise, right? So the producers of Europe need to figure out ways that they're actually going to grow their agricultural output, right? And the English and the Dutch are the ones that are going to start looking for new ways to actually get this thing done, right? They were actually led by the Dutch more than anybody else. But this brought in this thing called the agricultural revolution, where literally a trend that started in 1650 that lasted up all the way up until 1850. And you're like, we're back in the 1650s again? Yeah, like, okay, again, we're jumping back and forth. All this stuff happens parallel to one another, right? Like stellar parallaxes. It's just like, it's all right? So now, when the open field system was eradicated, okay, the agricultural revolution is defined, or defined itself anyway, post-date. It's not like anybody was sitting around and like, you know, Jillian Kenny was looking at her fields and being like, I should rotate crops without fallowing them and maybe plant turnips instead. Agricultural revolution! Like, that's not how it actually happened, right? But the earliest phases of the agricultural revolution saw the extreme adoption of this thing called the enclosure system, okay? What the enclosure system or the enclosure movement is when wealthy lords were buying up all of these strips of land from these villagers and then breaking them off with fences, enclosing them, getting one family to actually farm one area, okay? So enclosure, they enclose them, right? Whenever you see, let me see if I can go ahead and fast forward to it. Whenever you think enclosure, this is what you should be thinking of, right? That right there, that's the enclosure system, right? And the enclosure system is literally closing these things off and getting certain families to farm certain enclosures, right? It is economically more viable, and it makes much more sense. All right, so, and then they're going to also adopt new farming techniques along the side of it as well. They're going to get rid of the fallow system because they're like, this is just a waste of 30% of my land because it's just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So what they decide to do instead is plant nitrogen-rich crops in the soil to actually help rejuvenate it a little bit. Things like turnips, peas, beets, tuber vegetables, that actually, when you leave some of them behind, their decomposing mass actually fertilizes the soil back again, right? And what the lords would do is for each enclosure, this enclosure you're going to go grow turnips, this enclosure you're growing peas, that enclosure you're growing beans, and they would actually rotate them through the entire system, right? So it's a genius idea when you think about it. But the problem is that it actually was not economically viable for the poor nearly as much, right? So the revolution, though, early on was led by these people known as the Low Countries, right? I.e. Holland, Netherlands, the Dutch, all right? And some of you are like, well, wait a minute. Didn't we talk about these guys a while back when they broke away from Philip II? Yes, but we'll get into that in a second. So the dense population of the Netherlands is actually going to drive this movement to provide for its people. Because as the Dutch began to prosper, make more money, they died less, and their population began to advance, right? The East India Company is beginning to bring in new types of goods because they were founded in 1602, so they're bringing in like healthy spices that can be used to make medicines, and as their population began to rise, they got to figure out how they're going to provide work for all these people. So Amsterdam and large cities grow because of this, but what they're going to do is very, very smart. But really quick, just so you know, a lot of this happened during what was known as the Dutch Golden Age, right? So this agricultural revolution took place in the late 1500s to mid 1600s and forward, known as the Dutch Golden Age, right? So after breaking away from the Spain and their HRE way back under Philip II, when we talked about him, the Dutch reworked their government into a self-sustaining republic, where they divided it into 7 different stads, right? And they were backed religiously by Calvinism. The great thing about Calvinism is it makes a lot of money because you're not being distracted by a lot of frivolous things that you don't necessarily need. All right, so when we get to the Consumer Revolution later, the Dutch not a fan of the Consumer Revolution, right? So Calvinism, of course, is going to help organize their stads into 7 different provinces. The leader of the government is going to be known as the stadholder, and he also leads the military as well, but he's much more of a figurehead and a military leader than he is like a king, right? So typically this person was actually the Prince of Orange, like William III of England. Remember when we talked about William and Mary, right? It was William of Orange was his title before he ever actually became King of England, right? Now, the Dutch Golden Age, though, lasted from the mid-1600s to the 1700s. If you actually go farther back into the 80 Years' War, when they were trying to break away from Spain, you could even go back then. And they're going to see a massive lurching forward of things like art symbolized in their Dutch Golden Age, right? This is the Night Watch by Rembrandt, right? Rembrandt, very, very famous figure. So this is another very, very famous piece as well. This is a Dutch merchant guild actually meeting together. The Dutch Masters is what they're called, right? So, and as you can see, the really cool thing about all of these pieces of art, though, they're all having to do with people living their normal lives. Wearing Calvinist garb, women dressing very modestly, kind of everything different from the old European way, because the old European way used to always be, if I'm going to put a painting in my home, it has to have Christ in it, right? If I'm going to paint a painting in my home, it must be Italian. If I'm going to put a painting in my home, it must be like grandiose and symbolize the class of which I am not a part of, right? The Dutch Netherlands actually symbolized using their art in the old masters' ways of showing normal scenes, right? So, and they're also going to be making tons of money during this golden age, right? They actually were a part of two huge market bubbles, but they also invented something very intelligent. So this is Tulip Mania, all right? So like they actually discovered tulips and then sold them to the Austrians, and then like everybody was like, oh, these flowers, and they were worth 500 times what they should have been worth for a few months in the 1700s. That was Tulip Mania, right? So, but procured by the Dutch East India Company, right? Civets cats was another thing they dealt in, which are these weird little cats that eat coffee in Indonesia, right? And they got the hold of those from the spice trades in Asia, and they would use them to make perfumes, make musk and stuff like that, right? Oh, poor Civets cat. I don't know how I feel, though, but because the Indonesians allow them to eat the coffee, and then they make coffee out of the poop. Now, anyway, so it's like, what are we really like dealing with here? Now, but this is the most important thing the Dutch invented during their golden age. It's a functioning stock market. All right, joint stock companies began to rise up in the Dutch Golden Age where people could invest in a company, giving them capital to actually further their gains, and whatever percentage they invested in said company, they got back in a return, right? So you understand what I'm saying? That is a genius concept. So economically speaking, the Dutch were doing great things. Now, because of all this stuff, their population begins to rise. They begin to push forward. They got to figure out what the heck we're going to do. And the Dutch mastered the idea of draining swamps, right? So what the Dutch began to do is they drained off swamps, right? And they actually began to enclose different areas. And swamps, you have to understand, are full of nutrient-rich soil because it's mostly dead matter that's existing on the bottom of these different, like, water bodies, right? So when they drained the swamps off, they would enclose them in, and they actually drained these marshes for farmland, specialized their crops, and grew massively. And they're going to also take a lot of crops that they found in the New Worlds, these like different areas of India and different areas of North and South America. They're going to find crops that they raided off of Spanish maritime vessels and things like that, and they're going to use them and grow them in the very, very solid, like, borderline, reasonably temperate Dutch like climate, and it's going to grow phenomenally well. This painting right here, you can actually see these gigantic rabbits, and like this is actually supposed to be a Dutch farmer's market, right? Showing the wealth and the progress of the Dutch period. And again, another mundane, just very regular day-to-day scene in the Dutch environment, right? So the English are going to follow this idea, right? But then a crazy nut job named Jethro Tull shows up. And I know some of y'all are thinking the band, right? Calm down, Jules. But it's about his invention, okay? So Jethro Tull kind of lays the foundation of the Industrial Revolution with the invention of a very cool device called the seed drill, right? The seed drill. Now, it was a device for direct planting of crops. So now with the enclosure system and inventions like the seed drill, the English can now close off land, push forward, and grow massive amounts of crops quickly, right? This is going to help specialize the breeding of livestock, which is going to be invented in England as well. And by 1870, England was producing 300% more foodstuffs than they did in 1700, while only increasing the amount of land used by 14%. That is an insane statistic, right? And to get a little closer look at the seed drill and what it is, it's basically just like it's an automatic planter attached to a plow, right? So as this thing would go forward, the vibrations from the ground would actually knock this little hopper, and it would actually, like, excuse me, the seeds would drop into the new notch created by the plow, and then this back area would just cover the dirt over, right? So it makes the entire process of planting much quicker and almost automated, right? So these new agricultural revolutionary ideas are going to force the parliament to do really crazy things, like force the enclosure of the remaining land in England to meet the demand of urbanization, right? So, because following the Industrial Revolution, when everyone began to flock into the cities and population began to explode, you had to still produce enough food wares to actually provide for these populations, right? So by 1815, the end of the Napoleonic era, which I know we're fast-forwarding aggressively, but it's okay, Parliament forced the enclosure of the rest of the land in Europe, right? So this enclosure system is a phenomenally important system, right? It's going to have a lot of negative impacts, though, particularly on the poor, right? So are we surprised? All right, so now the negative impacts on the poor, landless laborers with no rights, right? Because here's the thing, as the enclosure system was adopted, it decreased the need for feudal villages, right? So you didn't have villages owning certain plots together. You now had individual families owning certain plots. So several of those other families got ousted out of these villages, and they became landless migrant workers, right? So they would end up going to different farms and areas trying to find work, and they would work from dusk until dawn, 6 days a week, all year round, getting paid minimal to almost nothing in a wage, right? Unemployment is going to skyrocket as well. It's also going to lead to this idea of proletarianization, the idea of a workforce that needs work and is willing to work to produce goods for a wealthier class, right? So the transformation of peasantry from landless owners to landless workers. All right, so, not landless owners, but landowners to landless workers. Landless workers is now creating this gigantic group of people that will eventually be shoved into those factories that pop up during the Industrial Revolution, right? So, there you go. Now, along with this, though, with this problem of migrant workers and things like that, rural industries began to pop up. And that's where we saw the growth of this thing called the cottage industry, right? The cottage industry was an attempt to try and fix the problem of unemployment after the agricultural revolution. It's sort of, all right? Because what it ended up pivoting into is the cottage industry kind of just turned into a way for these enclosure families to just make more money on the side by creating products in their homes, okay? So in the cottage industry, workers were hired by city merchants to produce items in their homes using hand tools, and they would actually work for a lot less than urban wages, okay? So urban workers typically had to have dormitories provided for them. They had to be fed. They had a lot of other needs, whereas these rural workers in their own cottage homes were producing food for themselves, which means they were much more sustainable, and they would work for a smaller wage, all right? So this is going to bring rise to this idea what these genius merchants had called the putting out system, right? The putting out system was when these merchants would bring in all of these raw materials from the colonies, right? As the colonial environment began to explode, they used to bring in all these raw materials from the colonies, and then they would actually take those raw materials to different cottages, and those cottages would actually make them or process them into usable chunks. You understand what I'm saying? So, for example, let's use an example real quick. So, let's say I'm the merchant, right? And I just got a huge shipment of cotton from India, which actually, surprisingly enough, was the biggest producer of cotton all the way up until, I think it's around 1800. So, now, the rise of the putting out system, let's say I just got this huge shipment of cotton in from India, right? And then I know that out in the rural landscape, there are all these landless or non-land-owning laborers that are looking for work, as well as some people that are working in the enclosure system, right? So I would call up Shane and his family, Laura and her family, and then let's say Dion and her family, right? And so I would send this raw cotton to y'all, right? Now, there are several different ways that we could work this. I could either get Shane's family to do several different processes, or I could just get him to do one. So what I'm going to do is just do one. So what I would do is I would send the cotton originally to Laura. Laura would then take it and card it, which means actually weaving, like just banging it out into long, thin strips, getting it from being clumps into long thread, or like long, usable, like cotton batting. It's called batting, right? So, and then, yeah. So this cotton batting would actually be used. And then Laura would send it to me, which I would then take it to Slack's family, and Shane Slack's family are spinners, right? And the spinners would actually spin the cloth into yarn, okay? And they would actually use the spinning wheel to do so. Spinning actually became a very popular, not pastime, but work for widows and young women, so much so that it actually became a word used for shrewd, like, women in slang, like in England during the 1800s. An old spinster. All right, so, yeah, that's where it all comes from. All right, so did you just claim that you're an old spinster?
Well, I'm not.
So then that yarn would be taken from Slack's family, given back to me, and I would give it to Dion's family, and Dion's family would actually have a shuttle loom in their home, and they would weave it into cloth. I would then take that cloth and then sell it at a very highly marked up price. All right, so now, products were made in cottages, sold by merchants, rolled the price for higher profits. Tons of different variations to it, right? Because you could use this system for just about anything, okay? Hey, Daddy, you want to say hey to my AP kids? This is a different class. All right, so for example, here's the variations of spinning, right? There, of course, of our older women like spinning, or widowers spinning. And then this right here is actually a shuttle loom, flying shuttle, and I want to say it's like a bow loom, but it's a loom where actually entire families would be needed to operate it. Like a young boy would actually pass the shuttle through all the threads. The father would be operating like the the wooden bar that actually brought the thread back down to create textile fabric. So a shuttle, yeah, it's a shuttle. It goes and it just goes through it. The boy would pass it through. The father pulls it down, and then he passes it back through again. And that's how they would try to throw it. Yeah. So, but as you can tell, the cottage industry was a massive leap forward, right? Because this is going to lead to this thing called the Industrious Revolution. Some of you are like, I thought it was the Industrial Revolution. No, that's how we're going to process things like pig iron later in the 1800s, right? So the thing about the Industrious Revolution is it really kind of opened up the game for all of these regular Europeans, particularly the English and the Dutch, right? It was the idea that you were making money, not stuff, for your house, all right? So the Industrious Revolution brought on decreased self-sufficiency, but increased the ideas of consumerism, right? So now Laura, Shane, and Dion's families are making money that they can now use for products that they want, not ones they necessarily need, right? That's your Industrious Revolution. People are going to begin to work long hours of their own will to make money that they can then go out and spend on other things, right? All of these economic patterns are going to set the stage for the Industrial Revolution and the Consumer Revolution, which is going to happen later, all right? So, but as you can tell, people are going to begin to adopt rural, different rural jobs and things like that. That leads to hourly wages. And the great thing about this cottage industry, the putting out system, is it provided non-land owning workers to also work in times like the winter to actually make the money that they wanted to use for themselves, right? So to stay more economically viable. Now, were they making as much money as the merchants? Of course not. All right, so now, then we got to get into the fact that population is also going to absolutely explode during this time period, okay? Now, the biggest negative impacts of population before 1700 actually have to do with the Black Death, right? Which was on and off again from 1347 all the way up until the 1720s, when the last outbreak of the plague was seen in Marseille in France. Infant mortality, of course, was a huge factor in the 1700s. 1 out of every 3 childbirths in Europe prior to 1700 resulted in death of either the child or the mother, all right? From things like scarlet fever, typhus, different very early contractable diseases, right? War is another big issue, right? Poverty and the price revolution is going to cause a lot of impactors on population stagnation as well. And the price revolution, of course, referring to the inflation following the Spanish gold and silver influx, right? So now the population, though, is going to explode following 1700 because of these reasons. Number one, plague's finally over, right? So after the plague had finally ran its course in the south of France in the 1720s, population began to be able to stagnate a little bit and then grow following, okay? Better medicine is another big example as well. The cowpox inoculation actually came around during the 1700s, promoting the idea of vaccinating people against mundane diseases that could easily kill them, right? So absolutist efforts of better water and sewage systems are going to be on the rise. The enclosure and drainage of swamps is going to also limit insects, limiting the spread of malaria and yellow fever, right? Infrastructure is going to also help keep food fresh and move it faster, leading to healthier diets. The Columbian Exchange led to healthier diets as well, leading to population growth, and then new foods from the New World, like the potato, right? So, like, the potato was a huge, huge, huge crop. Did you know those actually came from Peru, Daddy? Potatoes are Peruvian. That's where they found them. But the introduction of the potato made healthier diets. Healthier diets lead to longer lives, right? So then moving forward, we had the death of the urban sector, right? Due to all of this cottage industry, putting out system, and all of these other methods that are putting development and manufacturing in the hands of these local cottage cottage industries and like these local home owners and local non-working landless laborers, the urban sector is going to begin to die off, right? So, and it's just going to have to change. But we're going to get into that in the next flip. All right? Sound good? So I'm going to go ahead and cut it right here and pick it up here in a sec, okay? Y'all have a good one.